Bill Shorten says he doesn't support changing the date of Australia Day. Now, Melbourne's Yarra City Council will no longer refer to the 26th of January as Australia Day and will host an event recognising Indigenous culture instead of a citizenship ceremony. Well, the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, has also slammed the move and said that it is out of step with national values. Well, Simon Breheny is the Director of Policy at the Institute of Public Affairs. He joins me now in the studio. Simon, thanks for taking the time to come speak with us.
My pleasure.
Is it out of step with national values?
Well, I think in this case both the Prime Minister and the Opposition Leader are 100% right about this. I think it's completely out of step, and we saw the Mayor of the Yarra City Council come out today and say that even within the Yarra City Council she thought that there was a majority of people who were in favour of moving the date. I think that that's wrong. I think that it's based on some anecdotal evidence about conversations she might have had with some friends of hers, but I very much doubt that right across the Yarra City Council you have support for this, and certainly you can't say that there's support right across the country for changing Australia Day.
What is the link between changing the date and national values?
Well, look, I think that really what Australia Day is about, it's about celebrating what Australia is. It's about celebrating our nation, and it's really about celebrating actually a lot of those British institutions that Australia would never have adopted had it not been for the 26th of January 1788. So I think it's really, really important actually that Australia Day is claimed by those who want to celebrate what it is to be Australian, and claimed by those who've got a positive vision to tell about Australia. One of the really disappointing things about the decision of the Yarra City Council is I think they've got a small view of Australia. I think they've got a sad view of what Australia is, and I think that there's a lot to celebrate in our country. Some of those institutions, like the rule of law, for instance, mean that we are a much more just country than a lot of places around the world, and we would never have been in that position were it not for those British institutions.
Surely, but those British institutions also, inflicted a lot of suffering on the First Nations when Australia was first settled. Surely you can understand the sentiments of the Indigenous people in regards to celebrating a day that they see as, well, the end of their culture, their livelihoods.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things is I think that we can both celebrate what Australia is today and where we've come from, and also recognise the difficulties of our history and of our past. And really, when we talk about Australia Day being on the 26th of January, and people say, there's a lot of emotion and tragedy tied up with that, yeah, I think that that's true. But that's not an argument for changing the date of Australia Day. It's actually an argument that goes right to the heart of what Australia is today. It goes to the heart of whether they think that British colonisation was overwhelmingly a positive or a negative thing. I think that's a much more fundamental question than whether the date is on the 26th of January or any other day. I think it's actually an argument against Australia Day as a celebration of Australia, and I think that that's very problematic.
Do you honestly think that a majority of Australians actually see Australia as a means of celebrating what Australia actually is? Is it all just not about barbecue, sausages, taking long holidays, and fireworks?
Well, yeah, look, as much as I...
Do you honestly think that a majority of Australians would stop and pause and say, this is a time we celebrate Australia for what it is, but also celebrating Australia for what it is marking the suffering of the First Nations, the Indigenous
I don't think it is.
people.
I don't think
well,
it is.
you need to acknowledge that, don't you? That is history. In order to go forward, you need to acknowledge history.
Well, I don't think that people think about Australia Day being a celebration of suffering. I think that at the very least...
Well, not celebrating it, but certainly marking it. And saying, today, on this day, we also mark the fact that there were people who were there before us, and they suffered under our...
Sure. I think people understand that, but I think that if you ask Australians what they're celebrating, what they're commemorating on the 26th of January, I think that it's a celebration. I think that overwhelmingly people say we are talking about the positive aspects of what it is to be Australia, to be Australians, and what it is to be Australian in 2017, rather than looking back at some of those tragedies that have taken place in the past, and I think that that's a good thing.
There's a lot of division on this particular issue, and it seems to be one of those political divisions. So if you're either on the left or you're either on the right, you're either politically correct or you're politically incorrect. That seems to be what this discussion is all about. Do you not see a compromise?
Well, I think the compromise is making sure that we retain Australia Day on the 26th of January. I don't think that they're... And really, I think that this comes down to...
Can I just throw you this suggestion that was once put to me? Perhaps... keep it on January 26th, but perhaps start the day with a dawn service. Start the day acknowledging the suffering of the First Nations, of the Indigenous people, and then throughout the day make it a more inclusive day of not just white Australia, but, you know, colourful Australia, I guess.
Well, I guess essentially what we're talking about here is a version of history, and the idea that Australia Day, that British colonisation, that those institutions are either overwhelmingly positive or negative. And
do you think it's positive or negative? Do you think the British institutions that colonised Australia were positive or negative?
Overwhelmingly positive.
But you do understand and you do acknowledge the suffering that these British institutions also.
Well, it wasn't British institution. I mean, it's not British institutions. It's not the rule of law or representative government or Westminster Parliament. Well,
it was British institutions that brought the settlers here, and those are the British institutions too that also decided to take in the indigenous people, cull them of their culture.
But this is a much broader discussion about what colonisation was. Not British colonisation, but the colonisation that was happening in the 16th and 17th centuries.
And January 26 is the symbol of that colonisation.
No, it's not. I mean, this is exactly the argument. I mean, there are those that say that, yes, that is what the 26th of January is about, but I think that this is exactly the debate we're having, right? There are people who say that 26th of January is a date that marks sadness and suffering, and there are those that say the 26th of January is a date that we should celebrate because it brought about not only great things for the millions of people who have joined us and become a part of Australia over the last 200 years, but also the fact that we have lifted hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty right around the world through the kind of institutions that we saw brought to Australia in the 18th century. And I think that is something to celebrate, not only for non-Indigenous Australians, but also for Indigenous Australians too.
Simon Brehenys, it's great talking to you. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.